Thanks everyone for Thanks everyone for joining. Today we have Sophie and we'll also have George join us in a bit. And we are just here to talk about their experiences working in climate, their motivations behind working in climate, and just try to answer any other questions that the audience might have as well. They're both members of the Work on Climate community. You can find us at workonclimate.org. And we are a community that's really focused around trying to help people transition into the climate space, or for folks that are in the climate space to find folks that are willing to make that transition. So why don't we start off with Sophie, just a quick introduction from you, and we can take it from there.
Sounds good. Hey everyone, I'm Sophie Sheeline, based in San Francisco, as I was just saying. I'm currently a product manager at Opower, which is a climate tech company working in the energy space with utilities on B2B2C sort of energy saving and other decarbonizing action related solutions. And I'll talk more about that as we get into this, but a little bit about my background. I actually studied mechanical engineering and conceptual art and architecture, and specifically after college thought I would go in one of two directions. One was like medical device design, and I worked on surgical robotics and oral healthcare and some other things, and also worked in an art studio in Berlin on installation art, and ultimately found that I really wanted to get into climate and also move from mechanical engineering to product management a little bit before then. So happy to talk more about my trajectory, but that's the 1 minute version.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Sophie. We also have George Tong with us today. George, would you like to do a quick introduction? Oh, I think he might have dropped off. In that case, oh, never mind. I think I do see him. I think you're on mute, George. Yeah, I think he's just having some issues with the audio. We can't hear you, George. Okay, circling back to you, Sophie. So you mentioned that you've had kind of this unusual career trajectory. So can you tell us a bit more about what brought you to the point where you started really getting serious about transitioning into a climate career? And then, for those of us in the audience who are trying to make that transition, what you did to try and make that transition happen?
Yeah, I think George's audio might have connected if you want to do an intro.
Yeah, 1 second. Sorry, I think I have some background noise. Let me go stop that real quickly, and I'll be right back. I'm just getting Zoom set up right now. That's my apologies.
Sophie?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I will answer that. So, yeah, my growing up thought I'd always want to work on health, and originally before college wanted to be a doctor. Then the week before I started college on that path, I was visiting someone in the hospital and realized I really did not want to work in hospitals or work in the system. And so I went into medical device engineering instead and try to kind of change the system that way. But I think, so I finished college in 2016, and, climate change was certainly on my radar, but it wasn't like a screaming siren to the same extent that it feels like today, or perhaps I'm just paying more attention to it. But as I was working in the medical field, it just struck me how, from a public health standpoint, climate change will have the biggest impact on health relative to kind of any health-oriented solutions that I could be working on. And so it sort of felt like the upstream version of working on medical devices was like working on preventative health through climate action, climate mitigation. And I think in 2019, I read The Uninhabitable Earth, and that was sort of like, I guess that made all the sirens louder in my head, and sort of just made me realize that like this isn't something that I can ignore. This is here now, and this will be the biggest thing that I can work on in my lifetime, or like the biggest impact that I can have. And so yeah, I'm happy to talk more about like how I went from that into actually working on climate, but I do want to give George a chance to actually intro first.
Go ahead, George. We can't hear you, George. Try clicking that little arrow next to the mute, and then it might just be synced to the wrong input device.
Okay. One sec.
Oh, we can hear you
Now
now.
we can hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, you can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. Sorry. I'm on a new work computer, and then I realized I have Zoom installed, and I was like, oh crap, I gotta reinstall it real quickly. So my apologies. Yeah, so just a brief introduction of myself. My name is George. I'm currently a senior software engineer at a small little startup called Glacier, where basically we work on creating, well, the overall goal is to basically end waste. And currently we're focusing on recycling, targeting recycling as the first opportunity, because there's a severe labor shortage and there's also increasing demand for recycling, and pretty crucial for driving a circular economy. So yeah, just a brief little intro about myself.
Great. And this is an open Q&A, so if anyone in the audience has a follow-up or a question, you can just raise your hand if you would like to ask it yourself, or you can send it to me over DM if you would rather I ask it, or if you want to ask it anonymously. So feel free to ask any questions if you have them. Yeah, why don't we start off with something that Sophie spoke about a bit as well, but let me direct it at you, Georgia, so we can hear your perspective as well. Sophie spoke a bit about what prompted her to really start thinking about working on climate. What was that sort of was there a tipping point for you firstly, and if not, what brought you to that point?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think there was like a one day some crazy drastic thing happened. Sorry, am I coming through okay now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
just double checking. Yeah, so there wasn't like one big, tipping point, one big moment that kind of changed the trajectory of my career. It was more so just a gradual buildup of, I was working previously at Robinhood, and I enjoyed working there, but it was definitely, getting there's like a lot of bad publicity basically, and also I was also getting to the point in my career where I was like, hey, I'm enjoying the work I'm doing, but it feels like I'm kind of just working to make someone else another dollar basically, and not necessarily to like something that I can work on. And after like a long day of work, I can come home and be like, hey, I'm proud of what I did. I know I, did something good for the world basically. So it was that gradual buildup. And then also this was kind of like I believe in the beginning of last year, January. So kind of, like the New Year's resolution time, and, a point to reflect and just like see like, okay, like what is it like, am I actually going in the direction that I want to go on long term? So, and I realized that, hey, a lot of my personal hobbies are like very nature oriented. Like I go skiing, snowboarding a lot. I go to the beach a lot to go surfing a lot. So, all my eggs are kind of in this one basket, and it's definitely in my also best interest to make sure this basket doesn't burn. So that was kind of the point where I was like, hey, like I definitely want all these like factors coming in together was like, hey, I definitely want to do something more impactful with my time and what I'm working on full time. So that kind of drove me to basically start looking for a job that tackled climate change.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think a lot of folks in the community can resonate with both of your stories. So why don't we get a bit into the job hunt itself? I think that's something that's top of mind for a lot of folks in the community. It's something that a lot of folks have challenges with as well. So my question for both of you would be, for your last job or your current job, when you were looking for the job, were you looking for climate work specifically, or did it sort of work out in a way where you ended up working on climate, or was it a very mindful thing for you? And then as a follow-up, what were some of the things that you learned during that job hunting process?
Sure, I can take that first. Yeah, so a little bit about timeline, setting the stage for me trying to work on climate. I think I read Uninhabitable Earth like early 2020, pre-pandemic, and then sort of might have started the job search earlier, weren't there so much sort of disruption with the pandemic. And then I was working a ton on the 2020 election and also very sort of sick for like 6 months. So I really started in earnest to look for new work and to look for climate work specifically in like December of 2020, I think. And I was I will say, I think there was a couple medical companies or other companies that I sort of applied to half-heartedly, but I was pretty much exclusively focused on climate. But climate is this like massive, it's not even a field, it's this like massive contingent of different industries. And so the way that I started looking was first just listening to a bunch of like My Climate Journey episodes to try to understand what the different subfields within the climate space were. And I found myself really drawn, I mean, initially drawn to like a few different things, but the energy space kind of stuck out. And so I also started listening to like the slightly wonkier podcasts, the Interchange and Energy Gang, which are now more or less Catalyst, and the Carbon Copy, which I strongly recommend if you're interested in energy, as well as like What It Takes. So just started like, I read something around the time when I started looking to get into the climate space, where someone said that like she replaced all of her media consumption or like media content consumption with climate oriented consumption. And so I basically did the same thing. I like only listened to climate podcasts. I joined Twitter and only followed energy people, or climate people generally. And just started like reading. And so once I started applying to jobs in, let's say, January or maybe February, they were across the board, but the way that I would like prepare for an interview was just I would like study the shit out of a company and out of like their industry for like 10 hours. And that sometimes when I did that, I would get really excited about it. And like, again, those companies tended to be more in the energy space. So I sort of started narrowing in on that subfield within climate. And also just learning a lot. And I think I don't think I needed to be a climate expert or an energy expert, and certainly am not, but I do think that it like made a difference in interviews to be able to speak in the language of energy wonk, even if I wasn't necessarily one myself yet or didn't have an obvious background that would lead me to have that knowledge. It just kind of like showed that I was genuinely interested and specifically excited about like this one section of the climate space. George, we can't hear you again.
Still can't hear you.
Okay, one last time. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
I literally like, I like click on that up arrow next to the mute button, and then like, I don't change any configuration, but when I press that arrow, it just starts working for some reason. Okay, but yeah, so I apologize. You're gonna keep hearing me say, can you hear me now, for a little bit of this talk. So yeah, but apologies about that. So just to recap real quickly, the question is specifically, were you exclusively looking for climate related work? And also, what the path for how you started looking and to where your current job is. Is that the question? Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, so to start out, when I started my job search, I was pretty much exclusively looking for climate related roles. And it's actually quite interesting hearing Sophie's point of view, because it's pretty much, I did took a somewhat similar path, but it's actually also quite different as well. So when I first started out looking for my climate related roles, this is around beginning of last year, as I mentioned, is when I started diving in earnest. And I wanted to basically, my first thought was just to bias to action. And so I wanted to actually see test the waters real quickly, see if I was actually, interested in working on this full time, basically. So I started looking into side projects and open source, climate specific engineering projects and software projects. And I started contributing to them. Specifically, I think I contributed to Breakthrough Energy Sciences. And they have a whole open source team, and they're pretty welcoming. So I went in, hopped on, started interacting with the community, finding problems that I could, help with. And at the same time, it was just kind of a learning process for me as well, because I got to basically learn a bit more about the kind of problems that are in the climate tech space, and what I, as in my skill set as a software engineer, can actually contribute to this problem, basically. At the same time, after I kind of did that confirmation process, saying hey, I do find joy in this. This is something I want to do long term. I started doing something similar to Sophie, where I basically just started consuming content like crazy, trying to learn as much as possible about the climate tech space, because as she mentioned, it's an absolutely massive space. It spans so many different disciplines that if there's a type of role or something that you want to do, you can pretty much find it in the climate tech space. So wanted to figure out what specifically, area I wanted to dive into. Initially, I was really bullish about blue carbon and basically ocean sequestration. But then I gradually realized that, hey, my skill set didn't really fit really well into that area. Unfortunately, as much as I like to think myself as being able to learn stuff quickly, I don't think I'm a marine biologist by any means. So I think I gradually drifted towards, I made a list of criteria of what I wanted to look for in a full-time job. And I pinpointed one of the top ones obviously was climate related, right? But I also wanted a small company. I also wanted, I wanted to be real world hardware interfacing, because I wanted to pick up some hardware engineering skills as well. And I also wanted to stay in the Bay Area. That's just a personal preference. I have a lot of roots here. So that ultimately, those criteria ultimately let me narrow down the search radius. And then I pretty much just found a list of companies that I was hey, I think it would be a great batch for me. And I just applied, and ended up, I think Glacier was one of the top options, and I ended up here.
Great, yeah. I think there was a good suggestion from Sean in the chat, George. Maybe you want to try, dialing in from your phone. Next question that I had, I think both of you touched on a pretty important theme. I think that's pretty relevant for a lot of folks that are trying to make transitions into this space, that perhaps haven't had an academic background in the space, or haven't already been working in fields that are adjacent to the climate space. You spoke about this sort of almost domain expertise barrier. And so if you mentioned that once you started showing that initiative, showing that curiosity, perhaps it wasn't as big of an obstacle or a barrier as you might have initially thought of. So that what I wanted to ask is, are there any other kind of misconceptions that you've since cleared up once you actually made that transition? Now that you're on the other side, were there things that you thought maybe were barriers or obstacles or issues that you realized weren't as much so? And this could also, let me expand it to also your discipline itself. So not product management or software engineering specifically.
Yeah, I think for me, I would say when I was looking for a job, I already was a product manager, but it was in the context of a startup. And I never actually worked with another product manager. I was the only one. And I think for me, some of the things that were difficult about job search were, one, just that like most product management positions in the climate space were asking for 5 years of experience, which I had like 10 months maybe. And I guess, yeah, no, that was almost the bigger barrier than familiarity with the climate space. But I did find that I applied to a bunch of roles that had experience requirements that were well beyond what I actually had, and in some cases got them, or at least got far in the interview process. So I think that's like general wisdom, but don't like hesitate to apply to jobs even if you don't have all the criteria. And I'd also say that I found that people were really, I don't know if this is like a misconception, but I found that people were really, people in the climate space were really helpful and encouraging of other people trying to get into that space. And so just like reaching out to people through Work on Climate or the MCJ Slack community, I was able to connect with a bunch of people who then connected me to like other people in the climate space. And I think that's how at some of these companies, I was able to like get a first interview, even if I really did not have the requirements for the role.
Yeah, so I took someone else's suggestions of calling in. So am I coming through okay right now? Okay, cool.
We're just getting a bit of an echo.
Okay. Sorry, okay.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah, go ahead.
I've got a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it,
Feel
Pete.
free to ask a question.
How many different companies did you end up applying to before you actually ended up finding your current position?
I can answer that personally. Apologies, I might have a slight echo. Let me try to figure out that issue. Actually, Sophie, do you want to take this first as I try to work out my issue?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly. I think that there's like places I actively interviewed for was probably like 8, and I probably submitted applications to another like 2 to 5 that I like never heard back from at all and have already forgotten about. And I had 3 climate offers of those that I was applying to.
Cool. On my side, I had about, or I believe how many I applied to? I believe I applied to around 5, 7 companies, I believe. Yeah, because I think my search criteria kind of narrowed it down quite a bit. So I didn't like send a massive like shotgun blast to like a whole bunch of various companies by any means. Yeah.
Any follow-up, Pete, or anything else that you wanted to ask? There was a great question. Awesome. There's a great question from Lynn on the chat as well, which is, she finds herself feeling a little skeptical of large, long-standing for-profit companies suddenly being involved in climate-oriented work. So a question for the panelists: do you think this skepticism is warranted? And is there a way for us to tell if a company is legitimately solving problems or just trying to make money in a new space, greenwashing? And finally, does it really matter what the company's intent is, which is more of a philosophical question?
Yeah, great question, Lynn. So I guess first on Oracle, technically I do work for Oracle. Really, I work for Opower, which was a startup that was entirely focused on energy savings and climate work, and then was later acquired by Oracle, and in many ways is operationally independent from like big Oracle. I think And if it felt like I was working for Oracle on a day-to-day, I don't think that that would be a pleasant experience for me, because like the CEO of Oracle is, or not the CEO, but like Larry Ellison is not exactly like a climate advocate. And I don't think like he cares about decarbonization, but we are sort of like independent enough from that, that that doesn't really impact our work. And like Opower's focus has been and will continue to be decarbonization. That said, I think like in terms of, does intent matter? Or well, let's back up to the like, is a company legitimately solving problems or like just greenwashing? And I think there it's like you have to look at outcomes. If someone can point to like, in our case, it's like 31 terawatt hours of energy use avoided, and like there's a sort of carbon emissions equivalent to that, like that's work that we did, and whether the intent was to make money or not, it's clear. I think that there's a lot of like greenwashing and advertising that I would not trust, because it's like not specific, or it's only, someone can say like, we make this with like 90% less emissions, but it's because they're making it with like, 3x the water and like other problems. And so I'd say like, look at the metrics that people are actually using to evaluate themselves in terms of like companies, and whether intent matters. I think it matters to me on like an emotional and like moral principle level, though I don't know that it needs to matter. Like I think I would rather work for someone who will make the decisions that will be decarbonizing, rather than that will like increase the bottom line. And so I'm glad I do feel that way. But I think that there are people who like are looking at the climate space and are like, we can make a lot of money here, but they're also going to make a big impact. And so I don't know that it needs to be like intent or money making, or like doesn't need to be one or the other. I think that there's nuance. It can be both, but it's partially just like, who do you want to work for, and who will you be excited to wake up for every day?
Yeah, thanks. Like I've been working in nonprofits for a while. So like my general inclination is like nonprofits, but now I'm just realizing that like nonprofits don't get that much done. And it's kind of frustrating. And so I feel like where the real impact is going to be when money is involved, but it's hard to kind of discern between somebody who's actually doing something that has a big impact and somebody that's just like, yeah, this is a new great space and I just got a whole bunch of money from X, whoever. And so I don't know, it's kind of hard to tell when you're looking at jobs where those places lie. But good to hear that you feel good about Opower.
Any thoughts to share on that, George?
Yeah, I think honestly, Sophie gave such a great answer that's kind of hard to follow up, I'll be honest. But I mean, I just echo her sentiments that I think that ultimately, like if you want to legitimately tell what the company's like actually doing stuff, then just look at actions and output. Like, don't look at what they say, just look at like what they've actually done. And you can just basically figure out a track record pretty easily that way. And also, if like you're joining a small enough company that I guess doesn't have enough time of existence to have like a big track record, I think generally just like reaching out and talking to the people, like you can get a pretty good sense of like, hey, these people are like legit and they're actually like interested, just based off of like, internal company processes, like basically company values and so on and so forth. Like it's very clear that, hey, they're in it to actually do something versus here just make a bunch of money. And I also plus one to what Sophie said, that like, hey, like I think ultimately the company's intent is just more like it's like a personal thing, and that even if a company's intent is to like make money first and then impact second, or impact the climate second, like they're still it's just based on their output and actions that they're actually still making an impact, and like that's moving the needle. And I mean, personally, I'm all for it, but I guess that's a question that I think you have the answer for yourself, pretty much.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that insight. We have a question from Rachel next. Rachel, would you like to go ahead and ask the panel?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm just wondering if any of you can comment on the availability of remote jobs in climate. I don't know if any of you have experience or just the kind of jobs that you've seen around. That's certainly the situation that I would be in, and I'm not really sure how it translates to the space.
Yeah, I can take a crack at that. I don't have perfect information. My job is currently remote, and like optionally we will be going back to the office in some hybrid way, but everyone has the option to just stay fully remote. I would say I found that software companies tended to be more likely to be fully remote or have that option than hardware companies. So like the mechanical engineering hardware companies that I was looking at, I tend to see that they're more in the office. And I also was looking for a job like a year ago. I'm not sure if or how things have changed since then. But I wouldn't say that it is different than other industries right now, or like I don't really have reason to believe that it looks different than others.
Yeah, I think I'd also agree with that. I think software companies in general tend to be more remote friendly, but it's not just specifically to software roles. I think just for an example off the top of my head, my company, surprisingly, we have a mechanical engineer who is full-time remote. Of course, she's asked to like fly in once in a while, but yeah, she's like for the most part, she's actually quite. I think she lives on the East Coast, and she calls in and works like. And I'm on the West. The company's headquarters on the West Coast. We also have an executive assistant that's also fully remote as well, that we contracted out. So there's definitely, and personally, like I'm on a hybrid work scheme where I can work from home and also go into office whenever I need to work with hardware, basically. But I was definitely given the option when I interviewed around of being fully remote as well. So I think there's opportunity definitely out there. I can also name a couple of the companies that I applied to that were almost entirely fully remote first. And if you're interested in that, feel free to just message me afterwards, and I can just shoot a list as well. But yeah.
We have another question from Pete. Pete, go ahead.
It's not so much a question as a comment related to Lynn, to kind of add in. One is kind of, I'm currently working in the wireless industry, and I mean, one is I'm hoping that climate and climate solutions become mainstream and become profitable, because that's the only way in a capitalist system, that's the only way that they're going to be sustainable. And the effort and impact is going to be sustained and kind of grow. Unfortunately, for better or worse, that's how things are. So, I mean, I would definitely, when you're looking for criteria, I would definitely try and look at, you know, you're not just looking for a company, from my point of view, at least I'm not just looking for a company you've got to look at the bottom line. Like, if they can't make money, if you're in the for-profit world, you got to look at the bottom line, and they have to be sustainable. And I have worked for startups that were just fooling themselves in terms of the impact they would make and where they would go. And every startup has a hockey stick curve out there. And it really helps to kind of pay attention. If you can go out and if you have the wherewithal to kind of be able to go out and kind of talk to whoever the customer is for this company and to understand the market that the company is addressing, that's great. To the extent that you can do that with a new company, sometimes you just have to get into the company and actually be in there where you're like, oh yeah, this works, or oh, this is just this isn't working. I found LinkedIn actually helpful. Like, if I've gone in and I'm talking to that manager, or these founders, I can then go to LinkedIn and be like, oh, I'm connected to this guy who used to work with that manager. And then I go and talk to that guy and be like, is this guy just smoking stuff or is he like legit? And so the more you can kind of go out around the company, you can get a perspective back into the company. So that's how I would kind of approach it.
Yeah, thanks, Pete, for sharing your sense for how to build that idea of credibility around any venture or any company. There was a helpful suggestion from Maya on the chat that I wanted to call everyone's attention to. So in reference to the earlier question from who was the question from around the remote work, or from Rachel. You can search for the word remote or the term remote on Work on Climate, and you can find some job postings that mention that. Also, I believe that you can also search for that on Climate Base, which is another organization that we often work with that might have some more leads for you. I think they do have a filter around work type, whether you can work fully remotely, partly remotely, or whether on-site work is required. Maya, I think you are next in line for the question anyway, so please go ahead.
Yeah, so I was kind of wondering if you guys could comment a little bit on working for a sort of small startup versus a bigger, more established company, and kind of how you found the differences between those experiences. Because I feel like on Work on Climate, I see a lot of posts from startups, but I've never really worked for one and don't really know what to expect in terms of the differences there. And then I kind of have a follow-up question, which is if you have a sense of how frequently people change jobs in the field. I know in some jobs, it's pretty common for people to do something for like 2 years and then switch. Whereas in other fields, I'm coming from academia, people stick around for like 20 years. It's very different. So yeah, if you had any like thoughts on that, that would be great.
George, do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, happy to take this on. So I can give a little bit of insight on my experience. The tenure part, I might not be able to have as much experience comment on, but I can talk a little bit about startup versus like well-established company kind of vibes. So just a brief, I guess, and I don't even know if I could speak necessarily to like really big company, like if we're talking about a Google scale of like hundreds thousands of employees, that's like something I personally haven't experienced yet personally myself as well. But I have worked for the government before for a brief year, and I can draw comparisons from that. And also in the past, I also worked at Robinhood, which is when I left around I think 2,000 employees, and then now my current job, which is around I'd say like 10, I think it's 10 employees right now currently. So yeah, some big variations right there. Just some things that I imagine not even like climate specific that can probably hold true just overall between like larger companies and small companies is that there's just a lot more processes that are like very well established in larger companies that you kind of just take for granted that don't exist at smaller startups. For example, like having an HR team is like something that you can count on at a larger company, or having like a clear set process or vendors for like managing HR, or having healthcare and so on and so forth. That is definitely something that you'll find more established companies, whereas like smaller companies, like for example my current company, there's not like a dedicated HR team or a dedicated support team or something like that. It's just like a person who kind of like works on that kind of stuff. And you also get a chance on a smaller company to like wear hats outside of the specific domain that you're kind of hired for. So like I was hired as a software engineer, right? But I'm also working on some hardware stuff. I also helping out with some recruiting. I'm also helping out with a little bit of marketing, and all these things like is definitely not something that you can like a larger company. You'll kind of be like asked to like stay in your lane. It depends on the larger company for sure. But like you'll kind of be like you won't get the chance to like dabble within the various operations of like a business. Whereas I guess a much smaller company like purely because there's just not enough people around, like you'll get a chance to like, kind of work on kind of stuff. It's also a lot kind of like the day-to-day is a lot less predictable at a smaller company / startup versus a much larger company where you can kind of like get a sense like, okay, my next couple of weeks will look like this, whereas a smaller company the next couple of weeks is like, next week you're probably gonna, what you made plans for next week is probably not gonna hold true by the time next week is. I kind of touched a whole bunch of things. I can dive into any more if you're interested, but I want to give Sophie a chance to talk as well.
Yeah, thanks, George. So the company I was at prior to Opower was like when I joined, I was the 10th employee. But I was a mechanical engineer and I was like the 5th mechanical engineer. It was like a very hardware focused company. And yeah, I think that what George said around like staying in your lane versus like wearing all the hats is sort of like the prototypical distinction between startup and larger company. But I do think that that depends to some extent on which larger company. Like I really enjoy wearing lots of hats and like being scrappy. And so I made sure that the role that I took, even though it was at a somewhat larger company, when you think about Opower, and then like a massive company, if you think about Oracle, that I still would be able to be somewhat like independent and like wear different hats and not have that seen as sort of like stepping on other people's toes. But one thing that was important to me was I've never seen another product manager product manage. And so it was important to me to be at a company where there was like more than 0 other product managers, ideally at least a few, so that I could kind of get a feel for this, like all the different ways that one can be in this role and can be good at this role. And so particularly if you're like coming from academia and sort of necessarily taking on a different type of role, I can see it being valuable to, you know, regardless of the size of the entire company, just like optimize for at least, you know, a couple good mentors in like the role that you want to go into. And I think that there's a lot that can be sussed out about that, like how much you stay in your lane versus sort of wear a lot of hats, both during the interview process and like once you get an offer is almost always the best time to ask a bunch of really hard questions of the team and like really get a sense for what the expectations around your role would be if you have a sort of preference in that spectrum.
Maya, does that answer your question or do you have any follow-ups?
Yeah, thanks. I guess the only thing would be tenure, but it sounds like you're both pretty new in your field, so that might be kind of hard to answer.
Yeah, I don't know how much, like, one, there's so many new companies and so many like new people going into climate. It's hard to say what the, you know, next 5 to 10 years will look like. Within my company, there's a bunch of people who, when they leave, it's after like 8 years or 5 years, and like a handful that are after 2 years. But I do know, like, in general, software companies in the Bay Area, it's like 1.5 or 2 years is kind of typical. And so I don't know. Yeah, I don't have enough visibility into other companies or other roles to have a good say there.
Thank you.
We have a question from Ryder. Go ahead, Ryder.
Hi. Yeah, it's cool to see that you guys had some progress on this. I'm very excited for you, Sophie, and others. It's something I've been struggling with both in day-to-day, but also, you know, thinking about the interview process is having conversations about climate change. And so I'm curious what your conversations about climate change or climate emergency were like in the interview process. And like, were you trying to scope out whether your, you know, potential future colleagues and employers were, felt some, you know, to what degree they felt urgency about the issue? Yeah.
Sure, I can take that. Hey, Ryder, it's lovely to see you. Ryder, we did like a hackathon in like the first week that I started looking at climate stuff, and I like had no idea what I was doing, and Ryder taught me a lot of Python. It was great. So yeah, conversations around climate change. I'm trying to think. I don't know that it was something I like intentionally thought about in the interview process, but definitely sort of like sussed out, one, like where were people coming from? Was this like a lot of people that were working on climate in different ways before and are now like working on a new angle of it? Or does the founder of this company have no background in climate and they're just kind of like switching into it? And not that either of those mean someone like cares or doesn't, but that was sort of like one indicator that I looked at. And then I found that like when I spoke the language of like climate podcasts and also climate justice and just sort of like sussed out how people responded to that, that was helpful. Like, had they never heard the term climate justice or environmental justice or like that kind of thing? And did they like listen to similar or like listen to podcasts that I also was familiar with? And I don't think that any of these are like indicators like, oh, this person like cares or not, but those were like a few things that I looked to as like general indicators. But I found that like most of the people that I talked to that were working on climate were there because they wanted to work on climate, particularly at smaller or newer companies.
Yeah, I can also speak to that as well. Yeah, I can also speak to that as well a little bit. I think that there's a couple of things. I think one thing to point out, I'm not quite sure like where you're coming from with this question, to be honest, but I also just wanted to double like to say that if you are kind of looking for a job in climate and you don't like, I guess you're not like super in depth into climate, you don't like speak climate per se, or like you don't have like an intense background in climate, it's like companies won't really, like companies that focus on climate will be perfectly happy that you still applied and you're still interested in working there, because the fact of the matter is like we kind of have like, you know, the great retirement, you know, like the labor shortages at left and right. Like people just, like companies just need like really great employees to work at these companies. So you shouldn't feel like you need to be a super climate pro to like, and like talk climate or speak the climate language really well to be able to work at a climate startup or a climate company in general. So just to start out with that. Also, with respect to like actually figuring out like, you know, like what were your indicators for seeing if like people actually cared about climate, or if like, you know, the company actually like, you know, walk the talk or talk the walk, whatever that actually is. At least for me, like one of the questions that I kind of really grilled when I was interviewing was that like asking about company values and like making sure that, you know, something climate related was in that. And also like, I didn't just stop at that. So like I specifically asked for like incidences and like cases where like these company values were shown and like where they're forced to make a decision that like stuck to like climate related values that they had. Like one thing that kind of like won me over with like how Glacier responded was that like one of like the biggest pillars that they make decisions off of is that like, hey, does this decision like end more, like does this decision contribute towards ending waste? And if it like basically goes against ending more waste, then like we either won't take that path, or like we'll basically make a decision that ends up with more net waste ended in the world. And they gave me a couple of examples of that like how they decided on that. So like questions like these and like, you know, like rolling the follow-ups and making sure that like, you know, show concrete examples of actions that they've taken, I thought was personally pretty helpful.
Yeah, it sounds like, yeah, a great idea. I find it's hard sometimes to, I don't know, do a bit of the reverse interview. I guess, did you guys say that for the later stages in the interview process? Like maybe once you get an offer or afterwards when you ask those questions, or before that?
Yeah, I tend to ask the most kind of like put you on the spot and grill you questions until after an offer. Particularly any like, I think things that I would ask after an offer include like, well, of a manager, like what are you bad at? Like what mistakes have you made? I really appreciate people who are self-aware. And then of a company, like what trade-offs have you made around revenue versus like decarbonization potential, or like what sort of hard decisions have you made as a company around your climate impact, or your approach to equity, or like that kind of thing. And it is unfortunate that you often have to put in a lot of work to like get through the interview process and get an offer only to ask those questions. I'm sure that in some places, you know, they would be welcome earlier in the process, but I haven't like risked it as much. So I tend to wait. George, what do you think?
I actually kind of think a little bit of the opposite here. So, but I think this is honestly just personal risk assessment, personal preference. But I've always wanted to like, I always start out with like and grow with the harder questions, and like start my interview process with like making sure that they actually check off all of my check boxes, because I think that actually saves everyone time. In that like, hey, if you realize, hey, like you sussed out that like, or sniffed out that like, hey, this company is like not matching your values, then you can just be like, hey, like I'm not following through the interview process. And also like, basically you don't have to like, the interview process is super time consuming, right? It's like at least like 2 days, full days worth of work basically. And so you're saving like the company time, you're saving yourself time in that perspective. But yeah, also like that also only comes with the caveat that like obviously if you need a job, you need a job, right? So it is coming. I think what I'm saying also might come from like a little bit of a point of privilege as well. But yeah, that's just personally how I approach my job search.
Great. So just a quick time check. We are almost at the top of the hour. We have one more question from the audience from Travis. Travis, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you for hosting this conversation today. I've found many of the topics that have been raised here to be, I guess, instrumental in my own search for a space in this community over the last several months. Here's my question for both of you. As someone who is a normal smart person, but isn't a mechanical engineer or a software engineer, and who isn't in a younger cohort that's looking to career pivot in a different direction. But for instance, my background is law. I'm a former judge, but I find the earnestness around climate change and some of the emergent technologies to be so innately appealing that to they're doing anything else for much longer just seems like a waste of time. So my interest is in moving in this field. I'm interested to hear from you, whether directly or anecdotally, what have been any experiences that you've witnessed or learned about people who are sort of mid-career in tertiary fields looking to get into this type of space? I'd be especially curious to hear about Opower, given its transition over the last several years from startup to acquisition from Oracle.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's definitely I think I don't actually know how I'm going to answer this. I don't have a super clear answer in terms of like things or like people who I have witnessed making that sort of specific change into climate mid-career. I will say that like one of the beautiful things about the climate space is that there truly is there are so many different ways to work on climate, and having a law background is like incredibly useful for many of them. Within Opower, we do have a policy team that tends to have very deep energy policy experience, just because it's such a niche and like layered field, that like folks on that team tend to be very sort of like long-term energy people, but people who work in sales or like account management, project management, like people are coming in from all different angles at all different points in their career. And so I definitely think it is possible, and like it's just important to recognize all the different ways that one can work on climate with so many different like versions of a background. And even like for me, I spent a year working at an art studio in Germany, and like that shouldn't obviously influence my work on as like a product manager in climate, but like it does in some ways. And I think that all past experiences are important to bringing new perspectives to this work, particularly from folks who are farther along in their careers.
I know I don't work at Opower, but I can also try to speak a little bit about this as well. I actually a couple of points. One, legal backgrounds are actually super, I think more actually have a larger impact than, you would think for like other engineering roles and like that. I think like a vast amount of climate change solutions have to come from the government level, and like knowing how to, I guess, sue the government or work with the government or work within the bounds of the government to make them take actions that they need to take is super powerful. So, but that point aside, if you like really want to like pivot into, I guess, a more engineering related role, or pivot into like from a side field, as you mentioned, into like an engineering field, I know personally of like people who have managed to make that leap. For example, one of my old coworkers used to be a doctor and then just pivoted into software engineering, and two pretty separate fields. And I think his path towards that was kind of like a lot of, I can also touch more on this, like if you want to talk afterwards, because I think we're at time, but basically he did a bunch of workshops, a bunch of personal side projects, and then used that to basically leapfrog into his company and then gain some actual company experience and then kind of move around that way. But we are at time. I don't want to be conscious of people's time. So yeah, feel free to message me if you have any more questions.
Well, I just want to thank the panelists for sharing their their insight with us, and a big thank you to the audience as well for asking such wonderful questions. Thank you again for joining us today. And Sophie and George, if you would like to add links to job boards for your current companies, feel free to add that into the events thread that we have on Work on Climate. And likewise, for any of you that are interested in reaching out, or if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to post them in that thread. That way, the other audience members can also follow along. But thanks everyone for spending an hour with us today. I really enjoyed the conversation. Have a good rest of the week. Thanks all. Bye.